At 3:42 a.m. on September 8, 2024, Captain Elena Rodriguez felt her Boeing 767 shake violently as she flew through what looked like harmless clouds over the Pacific Ocean. But within seconds, she realized she wasn't flying through clouds at all. She was flying through a massive volcanic ash cloud that would turn her routine red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo into a nightmare. 12 passengers and crew would fight for their lives at 41,000 feet, with engines failing, windows cracking, and the aircraft slowly falling from the sky like a wounded bird. Captain Rodriguez had been flying for 23 years and had never experienced anything like this before. She watched her engine instruments turn red one by one, while volcanic glass particles, finer than flour but harder than concrete, began eating away at her aircraft like invisible sandpaper. The cockpit windows turned foggy, making it impossible to see outside, while the engines, designed to run on clean air, started choking on the microscopic volcanic debris that was now flooding into every part of the aircraft's systems. Flight 284 had taken off from LAX at 11:30 p.m., with 298 passengers including families going on vacation, business travelers heading to important meetings, and an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary by taking their dream trip to Japan. None of them knew that Mount Shishaldin in Alaska had erupted 6 hours earlier, sending a massive ash cloud drifting southeast at high altitude, invisible to radar and undetected by weather services because the ash particles were so fine they didn't show up on conventional detection systems. The first sign of trouble came when Captain Rodriguez noticed the outside air temperature gauge fluctuating wildly, jumping from -67 degrees to -45 degrees in seconds, which should have been impossible at cruising altitude. Before she could process what this meant, the number 2 engine began surging, its power output dropping and rising unpredictably like a car engine running on bad gasoline. First Officer Marcus Chen, who was only 6 months out of flight training, but had already proven himself as a calm and capable pilot, immediately began running through the engine surge checklist while Captain Rodriguez tried to contact air traffic control. Their radio was filled with static and interference caused by the electrically charged volcanic particles surrounding their aircraft like an invisible storm. In the passenger cabin, people were starting to notice something was wrong as the airplane began shaking more violently than normal turbulence. Flight attendant Sarah Kim, who had been serving drinks in first class, watched in horror as the cabin lights flickered on and off, while a strange burning smell began filling the air, making passengers cough and cover their noses with their shirts and blankets. The volcanic ash was so fine that it was seeping through the aircraft's air filtration system. Even though the cabin pressure was holding steady, people were breathing in microscopic particles of volcanic glass that irritated their throats and lungs, causing an elderly man in seat 12B to start having trouble breathing, while his wife frantically pressed the call button for help. Captain Rodriguez felt her heart racing as she realized the severity of their situation when the number 4 engine suddenly flamed out completely. Its turbine blades were destroyed by the abrasive volcanic ash that had turned them from precision-engineered metal into rough, damaged chunks that could no longer compress air efficiently. With one engine completely dead and another engine running at reduced power, she knew they were in serious trouble. The aircraft was now flying on only 2 engines, but even those were struggling as the volcanic ash continued to sandblast the compressor blades and clog the fuel nozzles. This caused power fluctuations that made the airplane feel like it was hiccuping through the sky, while slowly losing altitude, despite Captain Rodriguez's best efforts to maintain their cruising height of 41,000 feet. First Officer Chen was working frantically through emergency procedures, his hands moving quickly across the instrument panel as he tried to restart the failed engine, while simultaneously monitoring the remaining engines for signs of additional failure. Every attempt to restart number 4 engine resulted in nothing but warning lights and error messages, as the engine's computer systems detected too much damage to allow a safe restart. The situation became even more terrifying when the aircraft's pitot tubes, which measure airspeed by sensing air pressure, became clogged with volcanic ash. This caused the airspeed indicators to show conflicting and unreliable readings that made it nearly impossible for Captain Rodriguez to know how fast they were actually flying. Critical information needed to prevent the aircraft from either stalling and falling from the sky or flying so fast that it breaks apart from excessive stress. In the cabin, passengers were becoming increasingly frightened as they noticed the engines sounding different, with unusual grinding and whining noises that didn't sound normal. When 10-year-old Emma Martinez asked her mother why the airplane was shaking so much, her mother Teresa held her close and whispered that everything would be okay, even though she could see the fear in the flight attendants' eyes as they moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and preparing for what might come next. The volcanic ash was now so thick outside that it looked like they were flying through a sandstorm. Even though it was nighttime, there was an eerie orange glow surrounding the aircraft that made it feel like they were flying through the gates of hell itself. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez could barely see her instruments through the frosted windscreen that had been etched and scarred by millions of tiny volcanic glass particles hitting it at 500 miles per hour. The situation deteriorated further when the number 1 engine began showing signs of distress, its exhaust gas temperature climbing dangerously high as volcanic ash accumulated in the combustion chamber, creating hot spots that could cause catastrophic engine failure if the temperature continued to rise. Captain Rodriguez knew that if they lost another engine, they might not have enough power to maintain level flight, let alone reach an airport for an emergency landing. First Officer Chen was continuously calculating their options, trying to determine which airports were within range of their remaining fuel and reduced engine power. Every calculation showed the same frightening result. They were too far from any suitable airport and losing altitude too quickly to guarantee they could reach safety. This meant they might have to attempt an emergency landing on the ocean in complete darkness while flying an aircraft with severely compromised systems. The volcanic ash cloud seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. When Captain Rodriguez tried to climb above it or descend below it, she found that the ash extended from 20,000 feet all the way up to their current altitude and possibly higher, trapping them in a nightmare scenario where every minute of flight time meant more damage to their engines and a greater risk of complete power failure. In Seat 23A, retired engineer Robert Thompson recognized the symptoms of what was happening because he had studied volcanic ash encounters during his career in aircraft design. He quietly explained to his nervous seatmate that they were probably flying through volcanic ash, which was incredibly dangerous for jet engines. He tried to sound calm and reassuring even though he knew the serious implications of their situation and the limited options available to the pilots. The cabin crew, led by Chief Flight Attendant Maria Santos, began quietly preparing for the possibility of an emergency landing or ditching. They checked that life vests were accessible and reviewed emergency procedures while trying not to cause panic among the passengers. But the experienced travelers could sense the tension and seriousness in the crew's demeanor, and word began spreading quietly through the cabin that something was seriously wrong with their flight. Captain Rodriguez made the difficult decision to begin an emergency descent, reducing power on the remaining engines to prevent further damage while simultaneously losing altitude. This created a race against time where they needed to find clearer air before they descended too low to reach an airport. But the volcanic ash seemed to follow them down, continuing to assault their aircraft even at lower altitudes where the air should have been cleaner. The stress on First Officer Chen was enormous as he juggled multiple emergency procedures simultaneously. He constantly monitored engine parameters, recalculated fuel consumption, checked weather reports for alternate airports, and maintained communication with air traffic control when the radio interference permitted, all while dealing with the knowledge that hundreds of lives depended on his and Captain Rodriguez's ability to keep their damaged aircraft flying long, enough to reach safety. As they descended through 35,000 feet, the second engine began showing signs of severe distress, with power fluctuations becoming more frequent and more severe. This caused the aircraft to lurch and shake in ways that terrified the passengers, many of whom were now crying, praying, or holding hands with strangers as they realized their flight had become a fight for survival. The volcanic ash was relentless, continuing to sandblast the aircraft's exterior, clogging air filters, abrading moving parts, and gradually destroying every system that depended on clean air to function properly. The engines, designed to operate for thousands of hours between maintenance, were being destroyed in a matter of minutes by the microscopic volcanic glass that was harder than steel and more abrasive than industrial sandpaper. Captain Rodriguez's voice remained calm and professional, when she finally got through to air traffic control and declared a pan-pan emergency, explaining their situation and requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport. Even as she spoke, she could feel the aircraft becoming more difficult to control as the flight controls became sluggish and unresponsive due to volcanic ash interfering with the hydraulic systems and electrical components. The nearest airport was Anchorage, Alaska, still over 400 miles away. This normally would be an easy flight for a healthy Boeing 767, but with 2 engines severely compromised and the remaining engines showing signs of distress, it represented a nearly impossible challenge that would require perfect flying, optimal weather conditions, and a significant amount of luck to accomplish successfully. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had changed from the normal quiet of a red-eye flight to barely controlled tension as people realized they were in serious danger. Some passengers became sick from breathing the volcanic ash that had infiltrated the cabin air system, while others tried to comfort crying children or elderly passengers who were struggling with the stress and physical effects of their deteriorating situation. The aircraft's autopilot system began malfunctioning due to unreliable airspeed and altitude information caused by ash-clogged sensors. This forced Captain Rodriguez to hand-fly the aircraft manually, while dealing with engines that were providing inconsistent thrust and flight controls that felt heavy and unresponsive, making every adjustment a physical battle against systems that were slowly failing around her. First Officer Chen discovered that their fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the engines running inefficiently with volcanic ash contamination. This meant they had even less time and distance capability than their initial calculations had shown, creating a situation where every mile toward Anchorage was a small victory that brought them closer to potential safety, but also closer to complete fuel exhaustion. The volcanic ash continued to reduce visibility to nearly zero, making it impossible to see outside and forcing them to rely entirely on instruments that were becoming increasingly unreliable due to sensor contamination. The aircraft's weather radar showed a confusing pattern of returns that could have been ash, clouds, or precipitation, making it impossible to navigate around the worst areas of contamination. As they descended through 25,000 feet, still over 300 miles from Anchorage, the third engine began showing early signs of distress, with slightly elevated temperatures and minor power fluctuations that sent chills down Captain Rodriguez's spine. She knew that if they lost another engine, they would almost certainly not have enough power to maintain level flight, let alone continue their approach to Anchorage Airport. The passengers could feel the difference in the aircraft's performance as it became more sluggish and less responsive, with turns taking longer to complete and altitude changes happening more slowly. The unusual engine noises continued to create an atmosphere of dread and uncertainty that was made worse by the crew's obvious concern and the increasingly frequent announcements asking passengers to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen were working through their emergency checklists methodically, but they were running out of options as system after system showed signs of volcanic ash contamination. From the air conditioning packs that were struggling to provide clean air to the electrical generators that were working harder to compensate for increased resistance in ash-contaminated circuits, everything was failing. The aircraft's communication systems were becoming increasingly unreliable due to static and interference caused by the electrically charged volcanic particles, making it difficult to coordinate with air traffic control and emergency services. Captain Rodriguez managed to transmit their current position and intentions during brief moments when the radio cleared enough for communication. At 20,000 feet, still 250 miles from Anchorage, the situation became critical when the fourth engine, which had been their most reliable performer throughout the crisis, suddenly began surging violently. Its power output varied wildly between 40% and 80% of normal, causing the aircraft to pitch and yaw unpredictably as Captain Rodriguez fought to maintain control, while First Officer Chen worked desperately to stabilize the engine's performance. Passengers were now openly frightened as the aircraft's erratic behavior made it clear that something was seriously wrong. Flight attendant Sarah Kim made a carefully worded announcement, asking everyone to review the safety card and ensure their seatbelts were tight, without mentioning the specific nature of their emergency, but using a tone that conveyed the seriousness of their situation. Captain Rodriguez realized they were fighting a losing battle against the volcanic ash, which continued to accumulate in their engines and systems faster than they could compensate for the damage. She began considering the possibility that they might need to attempt an emergency landing at a smaller airport, or even consider ditching in the ocean if their engines failed completely before they could reach any suitable runway. The volcanic ash cloud seemed infinite, stretching in every direction like a malevolent fog that was slowly destroying their aircraft one microscopic particle at a time. The orange glow that surrounded them created an otherworldly atmosphere that made their situation feel even more surreal and terrifying. First Officer Chen's calculations showed that at their current rate of engine deterioration and fuel consumption, they had perhaps 30 minutes before they would be forced to attempt an emergency landing regardless of their location. This created enormous pressure to find the clearest possible route to Anchorage while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that they might not make it to any airport at all. The aircraft's flight management system was providing increasingly unreliable information due to sensor contamination, forcing Captain Rodriguez to rely on basic flying skills and manual navigation techniques that she hadn't used since her early training days. Every control input required more force and attention, as the flight controls became more sluggish and unresponsive. In Seat 15C, Nurse Jennifer Walsh was quietly helping other passengers who were having difficulty breathing due to the volcanic ash that had infiltrated the cabin, using techniques she had learned in emergency medicine to help people stay calm and breathe more effectively. Her husband, Tom, held their 6-month-old baby close to his chest, trying to protect the infant from the contaminated air as much as possible. The engines continued to deteriorate with each passing minute, their performance becoming more erratic and unpredictable as volcanic ash abraded the compressor blades, clogged fuel nozzles, and created hotspots in the combustion chambers that threatened catastrophic failure. Captain Rodriguez maintained precise control inputs to compensate for the uneven thrust and keep the aircraft pointed toward their distant destination. At 15,000 feet and 200 miles from Anchorage, the situation reached a crescendo when all 4 engines began showing signs of severe distress simultaneously. Temperatures climbed, power output fluctuated wildly, and warning lights illuminated across the engine instrument panel like a Christmas tree. Captain Rodriguez realized they were probably minutes away from complete power failure that would turn their aircraft into a very large glider with limited options for survival. The passengers could hear the engines struggling, with grinding, whining, and surging noises that sounded completely wrong. The aircraft's behavior became increasingly erratic as Captain Rodriguez fought to maintain control with engines that were providing inconsistent and unreliable thrust, making every moment a battle between human skill and mechanical failure. First Officer Chen was now working purely on emergency procedures, shutting down non-essential systems to reduce electrical load, transferring fuel between tanks to optimize weight distribution, and preparing for the possibility of complete engine failure, while simultaneously trying to maintain communication with Anchorage approach control to coordinate their emergency arrival. The volcanic ash had turned their Boeing 767 into a wounded giant struggling through hostile skies, with every system compromised and every minute of flight time representing a small miracle of engineering resilience and human determination. 312 people trusted their lives to 2 pilots who were pushing their skills and their aircraft beyond all normal limits. Captain Rodriguez's hands were steady on the controls despite the enormous stress. Her 23 years of experience allowed her to maintain aircraft control even as the engines provided wildly inconsistent thrust and the flight controls became increasingly difficult to operate. Her calm voice on the radio belied the desperateness of their situation as she coordinated with air traffic control for their emergency approach. The volcanic ash cloud finally began to thin as they descended below 10,000 feet, allowing slightly better engine performance and giving Captain Rodriguez hope that they might actually reach Anchorage Airport. But the damage was already done, with all 4 engines severely compromised and the aircraft's systems operating far outside normal parameters. At 8,000 feet and 100 miles from Anchorage, they could finally see ground lights through the clearing ash. Captain Rodriguez felt a surge of hope as she realized they had survived the worst of the volcanic ash encounter and were within gliding distance of the airport if the engines failed completely. First Officer Chen began preparing for an emergency landing with potentially unreliable engine power and compromised aircraft systems. The approach to Anchorage International Airport was unlike anything Captain Rodriguez had ever experienced, with engines that threatened to fail at any moment, flight controls that required constant attention and force to operate properly, and aircraft systems that were operating on the edge of failure. Emergency vehicles lined the runway and rescue teams prepared for the possibility of a crash landing. As the runway lights appeared ahead of them, Captain Rodriguez felt the enormous weight of responsibility for 312 lives as she guided their damaged aircraft toward what she hoped would be a safe landing. First Officer Chen called out altitudes and airspeeds from instruments that were still partially compromised by volcanic ash contamination, but were providing reliable enough information for a careful approach. The landing was rough but successful, with all 4 engines still running despite their severe damage. As the aircraft rolled to a stop surrounded by emergency vehicles, Captain Rodriguez finally allowed herself to feel the relief of having brought everyone home safely through one of the most challenging situations any pilot could face. The evacuation was swift and orderly, with all 312 passengers and crew members safely off the aircraft within minutes. Many of them kissed the ground and hugged their families who had been frantically waiting at the airport after hearing about the emergency. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Chen remained in the cockpit for several minutes, processing what they had just experienced and feeling grateful that their training, skill, and determination had been enough to overcome the volcanic ash that had tried to claim their aircraft and everyone aboard. The investigation later revealed that Flight 284 had encountered one of the most severe volcanic ash clouds ever documented, with ash concentrations high enough to destroy jet engines within minutes. The survival of everyone aboard was attributed to exceptional pilot skill, robust aircraft design, and what investigators could only describe as remarkable luck that allowed them to find slightly clearer air just in time to save their engines from complete failure. Captain Elena Rodriguez and First Officer Marcus Chen were awarded the highest commendations for airmanship and emergency response, but they both insisted that they were simply doing their jobs. They said that the real heroes were the aircraft designers and engineers who had built systems robust enough to survive such extreme conditions, and the maintenance crews who had kept their aircraft in perfect condition before their encounter with the volcanic nightmare that could have ended very differently for 312 people who were simply trying to get from Los Angeles to Tokyo on what should have been a routine overnight flight.